Okay, so now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our two speakers for today, Ramya Kumar and Rona Macdonald. Ramya teaches public health at the University of Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka. She holds a medical degree, a Master of Science from Harvard, and a PhD from the University of Toronto. Her research interests include access to healthcare, universal health coverage, the politics of global health, and women's health. Rona is a Scottish immigrant to Canada who trained initially as a botanist and then as an occupational therapist. Currently, she's doing a postdoc at the Department of Occupational Science at the University of Toronto, working on two studies that explore traumatic brain injury. Now, while these two scholars are very distinct in their geographic locations and their cultural backgrounds and their research interests, they have worked together over the past 6 months to find some common ground for this presentation. And for me, it's been thrilling to witness the growth of their relationship as they got to know each other and spent time really learning about each other's work. And this experience has been, they tell me, an incredibly enriching experience, personally and professionally. And as you will see and hear today, we will be fortunate today to be the beneficiaries of this beautiful collaboration. So welcome to Rona and Ramya.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rona Macdonald, and on behalf of Ramya and myself, we would like to thank you for joining us today. Ramya and I jointly share the honour of receiving Joan's Dissertation Award, but it wasn't, as Pauli said, until we began talking together about our dissertation work that we discovered a shared interest and concern about the situation and lives of women, and that we had engaged, albeit using very different approaches, with issues related to women's talk. We use critical bricolage as a metaphor to first frame our dissertation work that drew on forms of inquiry that foreground and make problematic the oppressions and injustices that differentially impact the lives of women. And second, to refer to the creative use of materials to construct new artifacts, what has been woven together today for this presentation. So over the next hour, we want to give you a flavour of the theory methodology we drew on for our work and of some of the issues and tensions we encountered along the way. We'll begin with the two short presentations and then shift into the more open dialogue question format. Over to you, Ramya.
Thanks, Rona. So in this presentation, good evening or good morning, afternoon at least, it's the evening over here to all of you. So in this presentation, I first explain how I arrived at my methodology and then discuss a few ways in which my approach shaped how I carried out my research to kind of give a flavor of my approach. So I see my methodology as having emerged from a series of movements. In terms of discipline, place, and people, I take you through these movements today to show you how my approach came out of it. Tenzin, if you could move the slide. Okay, thank you. Thanks. So this is Badulla, a town located in the heart of the tea plantation region of Sri Lanka. This was where I was first appointed as a medical officer after my internship or residency. So I worked at the Provincial General Hospital in the Department of Anesthesiology. I often did night shifts in emergency obstetrics. This was about 15 years ago when it wasn't rare to see women being rushed into the labor ward at the very last minute, at times delivering their babies on trolleys, often wailing and bleeding, Trolleys wheeled over uneven floors, doors banging. The noise, the chaos, tension, urgency come back to me. The women who came at night in this condition were mostly tea plantation workers. Many of them could not communicate in Sinhala, my first language. They spoke in Tamil, but I did not speak Tamil. We did not have translators, and finding a translator was not a priority during the night shift. I would anesthetize, often communicating with gestures and broken Tamil. I recall the fear, tears, and my complicity, all justified in the name of saving lives. These are some of the stories behind Sri Lanka's relatively low levels of maternal mortality, but there are heartwarming stories as well. So it was in Badulla that I began to think about ways in which Sri Lanka's public healthcare system, which has provided non-fee levying services since its inception and universally since the 1950s, how could this system be improved? Could it be more gender sensitive and representative of the ethnic diversity in the country? These questions brought me to public health. So I decided to pursue a graduate degree abroad. At the time in Sri Lanka, we only had a highly medicalized community medicine program, which did not engage with the content I was interested in. When reviewing public health programs, I came across the work of Sophia Gruskin, who worked on health and human rights at Harvard. Sophia encouraged me to apply, and I entered a master's program in global health and population, which took me to Boston. Tenzin, could you get the next slide, please? Yeah, so while we wait for the slide, I'm going to go on. So this is Boston and the Longwood Medical Area. It was my first time living outside Sri Lanka. At the time, I knew nothing about the violent histories of colonial medicine, the colonial legacy of the Harvard School of Public Health, its links with the Rockefeller Foundation, which had historically supported colonial governments in public health efforts to improve labor productivity on plantations, including on the tea plantations in Sri Lanka. Global health, successor to international health in the post-Soviet era, is putatively based on a conceptualization of health that transcends borders. However, in the curriculum, global health was framed as a philanthropic venture undertaken by experts in the global north to help people in the global south. The population agenda was advanced by demography without any acknowledgement of its troubling history. Most puzzling for me was the way in which microeconomics and rational choice theory guided healthcare financing and normalized health insurance-based financing systems with co-payments, deductibles, and so on. So I began to understand how Sri Lanka's free healthcare system, along with its exclusions and marginalizations, challenged dominant notions of healthcare, access and utilization, providing healthcare to masses of people. Although I was constantly questioning what I was learning, I did not know how to talk about these issues. I had no training in the social sciences or social theory. So, Tenzin, next slide, please. So I then moved to Toronto. Dalai Lama was one of the few programs in North America that provided critically oriented training in public health. At the orientation, I listened to Joan Eakin and Annie Manuel Byrne, who are both influential in terms of shaping my research. Joan in my decision to use critical qualitative methodologies, and Annie Manuel for her critical and historical approach to global health. In my first semester, I enrolled in a foundation course in social theory with my supervisor, Peggy Macdonald, a watershed in terms of my doctoral program. But things were in transition in Toronto as they were elsewhere. The social science stream was being phased out at Dalai Lama, as was the critical edge in the global health program, which was being subsumed by the Gates paradigm of global health. That is, public-private partnerships, vaccines, pharmaceuticals, M-health, and so on. So global health in whatever form was essentially a colonial enterprise. Global health discourses tend to normalize very different approaches to addressing health problems in the global south. Prioritizing cost effectiveness analysis or getting the biggest bang for the buck means health is viewed in terms of case numbers, fatalities, and money. There was so much for me to learn and unlearn, including from my training in medicine. For instance, taken for granted concepts like maternal and child health or family planning, or more fundamentally, assumptions and theories about the body, about illness and health. I began to think about my doctoral research project in 2012. The concept of universal health coverage, or UHC, was just gaining currency. 3 years later, in 2015, when I began writing up, UHC would be included as a target of the third Sustainable Development Goal on health. In this formulation of universality, coverage had replaced access, problematically normalizing health insurance as the way to healthcare financing. So there I was. I wanted to debunk widely accepted neocolonial theories of health reform that were being used to privatize healthcare systems in low and middle income countries in the name of universality. I also wanted to address the various exclusions and marginalizations within the Sri Lankan healthcare system. My approach had to be at once historical, anti-colonial, allow me to deconstruct global health concepts, as well as consider the multiple axes of women's oppression. None of the methodologies in the textbook seemed suitable. I recall moving from one to the next in Denzin and Lincoln and thinking, not this one. No, not this one either. In my second year, I took Rupa Lim Buyan's CQ-listed class on developing and conceptualizing knowledge. This class radically changed how I understood qualitative methodology, especially in relation to epistemology. Rupalim's message was clear. One did not need to fit into a tradition. There were reasons for my discomfort with the largely Eurocentric methodologies that made their way into textbooks. Most exciting was that I could create new traditions, methodologies that suited my work, my worldview. Critical qualitative methodologies give space to experiment, bring together bits and pieces from various theoretical frameworks. I thank my supervisor, Peggy, who was just brilliant in terms of theory and guided me through this process. The Marxist health systems literature is a small body of work that tends to focus on macro structures or policy concerns, but for the most part does not empirically explore how they play out on the ground. This is one of the gaps I try to address through my research. By doing so, I hope to co-construct an alternative narrative of access and contribute a decolonizing feminist critique of mainstream understandings of healthcare access. I used what I called a Third World Marxist feminist methodology, which located the emancipatory demands of historical materialism within a decolonizing feminist framework. Bringing together Western Marxist thought and Third World feminist approaches allowed for a more complex understanding of women's oppression as shaped by class, gender, race, or ethnicity, and the enduring colonial condition. In theorizing healthcare privatization, I used Bakker and Gill's conceptualization of reprivatization of social reproduction. Bakker and Gill identify four movements integral to what they call reprivatization, which I applied to healthcare to theorize the health policy shifts taking place in Sri Lanka. I employed Chandra Mohanty's approach to exploring women's practices, or I quote, the micropolitics of everyday life, end quote, to shed light on, I quote, the specificities of global capitalism, end quote. I extended Saskia Sassen's notion of feminization of survival to theorize the survival strategies women adopt as the state recedes from welfare. Experience is a troubling concept in qualitative research. Here I employed Banerjee's historical materialist understanding of experience as an interpretive relation that does not valorize any person or group's experience as a repository of truth, but rather upholds women's agency and recognizes, I quote, the potential for revolutionary knowledge in their experiences. recognizing the tension between my research agenda and creating so-called bottom-up knowledge. Just a minute, I'm checking my time. I knew my approach raised questions of representation. So Gayatri Spivak was helpful in this respect, a topic I will return to in the discussion. So this brings me to the next part of my presentation. How did my methodology shape what I actually did? Tenzin. So in the next slide, we're going to see Kandy. Kandy is in central Sri Lanka. This is home to me and was my research setting. My project was fairly simple. I asked, where do women go for healthcare? What are their impressions of the health services they use? How do they navigate public and private systems? And how are these questions shaped by social location? Data generation took place in two phases. The first was a preliminary study to explore the terrain and fine-tune my research proposal. In the second, I held focus group discussions and interviews and more meetings in the research setting. The research setting was included selected neighborhoods in a village administrative division in which my permanent residence was located in Kandy. While this certainly opened doors and smoothened the research process, it also involved questioning preconceived notions about the research side, as well as my alliances within it. But how did my methodology actually shape what I did? It did so in numerous ways. I can't go into everything here, but I focus on two methodological aspects that may be of interest. The first related to data generation, and the second to analyzing women's talk. With respect to data generation, rather than seeking to generate objective data about healthcare or create rapport with participants to encourage unbiased confessions, I try to harness what Rolston refers to as the transformative potential of the research participant interaction, in line with Banerjee's understanding of women's experiences. This involved engaging women in dialogue, sharing my own perspective, and addressing issues outside my thinking. I found this approach very challenging because my prior quantitative positivist approach to interviewing made me feel very uncomfortable with dialoguing and exchanging ideas during an interview. There is also a fine line between dialogue and imposing my view, which has been dealt with in the qualitative literature. Having been part of or undertaken or supervised a number of quantitative projects since returning to Sri Lanka, I see that some level of transformation is inevitable, even when adopting a positivist approach. I believe then that the researcher-participant interaction presents relatively unexplored terrain that could be harnessed for social change in critical health research. So getting to my second point, which is my last, influenced by the work of Dr. Josephine Wong, also in my committee, I approach translation as an interpretive process. As Josephine has showed us, the same text may be translated from one language to another in multiple ways. In translating from Sinhala to English, I confronted both practical and epistemological challenges. For instance, I was unable to find words or phrases that sufficiently conveyed what was being said. Instead, I had to translate the idea or the concept. Here, my middle class location would have necessarily shaped my understanding of Sinhala as spoken by other social and ethnic groups. Having spent years immersed in North American academia and quite fed up with the elitism of academic English, I decided to retain an indigenous syntax in my quotes to make visible the politics of translation. When transcribing the focus group and interviews held in English, I observed that the syntax used by English-speaking women corresponded to word-to-word translations of how the same idea would be expressed in Sinhala. Tenzin, please, could you change slide? So as an example, an English-speaking participant described visits from the midwife in her area in this way. When you are about 8 to 9 months pregnant, only they come. In this sentence, the two phrases, when you are about 8 to 9 months only, and they come, are arranged in the same order that they would be spoken if expressed in English. I retain this form of sentence structure in all my translations rather than changing it to the next form. So, but this was not without problems because I was actually imposing another sort of a middle class indigenous English syntax on translations of views expressed by women representing other social groups. But on the other hand, I would have naturalized another form of North American or British English had I returned this. So although I hope to, so this is my final point, although I hope to have a translation that would feel familiar to a Sri Lankan audience, in reality, my audience would not be Sri Lankan. Most researchers in Sri Lanka, including myself, do not have access to most qualitative journals, and many of the participants in my study do not read or understand English. Therefore, I really wonder whether making visible the politics of translation was merely gesturing towards the academy in the North. With this question, I end my presentation. Tenzin, thanks to my supervisors and mentors, and thanks to the institutions that supported my research. And finally, thanks, Tenzin, finally, thanks for listening. Tenzin, I included these images to let you know that my story continues in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka. Thank you. Now I hand over to Rona.
Thank you so much, Ramya. We'll wait for Tenzin. We're doing a slide change. Thank you so much, Tenzin. So I'd like to begin with a few expressions of gratitude. My dissertation could not have been completed without the support of my supervisor, Dr. Pia Kontos, who helped me keep my theoretical and methodological ducks in a row, among many other things, as well as helping me to find and reorder the words. My gratitude to her for sticking with me and to my other committee members, Drs. Catherine Morgan, Rebecca Rennick and Michael Iwama. And I also need to acknowledge the support of Tanya and Susan in Accessibility Services and the mentorship of Jennifer Poole. Thank you all. As learning is always social, relational and collaborative, I would also like to acknowledge the lineage of my CQ teachers, Joan Eakin, Bart Frank, Pia Kontos, Ellen McKirkin, Maria Mayan at the University of Alberta, Wendy Hall at UBC, Brenda Began, who was my external examiner, as well as my fellow learners along the way. And since my thesis brings to the fore issues related to language and culture, I want to call to mind the impact of colonisation on the languages of Indigenous peoples in Canada. People of my ancestry and other Western European ancestries who settled in Canada, elected governments and often belonged to churches who made it their goal to assimilate Indigenous peoples and steal their land. Residential schools accomplish this by taking children away from their home communities and punishing them for speaking their languages. Many Indigenous languages and cultures have been lost forever and more are in danger. However, as Indigenous peoples are working hard to preserve what they have left, let us do our best to influence governments to provide funding and institute any needed legislative and policy changes to support Indigenous peoples in preserving and revitalising their languages and cultures. Given the emphasis the CQ community places on theory and methodology, because critical discursive psychology and the kind of discourse analysis this approach informs is less commonly encountered in North America, I want to offer up a sketch outline, an interpretation that is partial and rudimentary. And for those of you new to the social sciences, please take heart, because when I began my research, when I first heard the term discourse and discourse analysis, I misheard this as discourse and discourse analysis. But despite not having a background in the social sciences, I have been drawn to ideas in the critical social sciences because they opened up and continue to open up new windows in my head into that which is commonly understood, common sense, and what can seem mundane. Tenzin, next slide, please. For me, this image speaks to the way such learning can be transformative. But now let me invite you into the theoretical space of my research. So if I was to ask you about your life, how you see yourself, about some of the experiences you've had, whether you recognize it or not, as Margaret Wetherell put it, to talk at all is to construct an identity. But because we swim in discourse like fish swim in water, we don't notice this. So in order to think about discourse and to pay attention to the kinds of identity work we do in talk, which includes how we work with and negotiate our many identities, we are required to shift away from what Schutz called the natural attitude to language. As discourse analysis is an umbrella term for a wide variety of analytical principles and practices that are underwritten by a multiplicity of different and often contradictory arguments, and because each variety takes up slightly different theoretical positions and stances, it's helpful to begin with an outline of the theoretical commitments of critical discursive psychology. Next slide, please, Tenzin. Discursive psychology, or critical social discursive psychology, CDP for short, was developed in social psychology in the late 1980s by Margaret Wetherell and Jonathan Potter. CDP can be characterized as social constructionist and interpretivist, with a specific focus on the function or action orientation of language. CDP is anti-cognitivist, so talk about experiences is not viewed to reflect an external world or to be a product of some underlying mental representation. And there is a rejection of the idea that language is a transparent, non-intrusive, do-nothing domain. In the same way that houses can be constructed from rebar and concrete, language as discourse is understood to be manufactured out of pre-existing linguistic resources, which in this tradition are referred to as interpretive repertoires. As Potter et al. Put it, language and linguistic practices offer a sediment of systems of terms, narrative forms, metaphors, and commonplaces from which a particular account can be assembled. So in terms of the sediment related to discourses of women's singleness, there are the familiar and largely pejorative stereotypical terms such as spinster, old maid, Ms. and Ms., independent woman, terms like leftovers, commonly used in Japan, or parasite singles, leftovers in China, parasite singles in Japan, and canonical narratives such as free spirits and fictional characters such as Miss Havisham. People are seen to be active selectors of language resources in CDP. In accounts, some resources are drawn upon and used in often very creative ways, and others will be omitted. So it's important to pay attention to what is said, how it is said, what is commonsensically left unsaid, and what is assumed to be beyond controversy. In terms of the action orientation of talk, as people, we do things with our talk. We explain, persuade, incite, argue, accuse, order, and refute. We only have to look at the recent events in the US to recognize that talk as tweets has effects, that talk is bound up with argument and persuasion and leads to actions in the world. But CDP doesn't just draw from one set of intellectual resources, but many. And being a complex blend of many theoretical traditions, such as speech acts theory, ethnomethodology, conversation analysis, sociology of science, rhetoric and positioning theory, there are still heated exchanges and debates about theory in the social psychological literature today. Unlike Foucauldian discourse analysis, where the overriding concern could perhaps be characterized as the analysis of power, the focus of CDP is on the micro-agentive subject and on the detail of the particular discursive practices employed by speakers. Perhaps like me, since lockdown, you have become even more aware of the significance of fleeting everyday exchanges, those micro-practices on the ground and how they contribute to our social life. And while there is a strong emphasis on speaker agency within the flexible deployment of language in CDP, it is recognized that as people, we are inevitably constrained by the cultural resources we have available to us. People are seen to be both ruled by and controllers of discourse, and identities are seen to be constructed, taken up and performed, also distanced from, perhaps refuted, and otherwise managed and negotiated in talk. So the theoretical commitments of CDP cash out in various ways in terms of how key concepts like talk, identity, subject, and categories are understood. For instance, the talk of the older every single woman interviewed for the study was viewed as a topic and from the perspective of a social practice with its own features, arguments, and practical consequences. Identity as a concept was understood to be fluid, emergent, dynamic, and always in the making, as opposed to fixed and stable. So I was interested in the positions the speakers took up in their talk, what terms they used to describe themselves, what images they drew upon, and how they worked with those images, such as the way they worked in talk to distance themselves from stereotypical images of single women. In order to help guide attention to patterns in discursive content and discursive practices, this tradition has three analytical tools that flow out of the theoretical commitments of CDP. Tools, very helpful. Tenzin, could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The first are interpretive repertoires. As identity is considered an emergent phenomena that is constructed out of culturally available discourses, the nature or content of the available resources is of analytical interest. Interpretive repertoires can be thought of as a lexicon or a compendium of terms about a topic or subject produced by history, likened to books in a public library that are always available to check out. Interpretive repertoires are the terms, ideas, and narratives that people have available to draw upon in talking about a particular topic or phenomenon, in this case, women's singleness. Interpretive repertoires are a culturally familiar and habitual line of argument comprised of recognizable themes, commonplaces, and tropes or doxa. For example, the tacit view that marriage and motherhood for women is the primary route to legitimacy and to a meaningful and purposeful life, or the stock phrase such as, if you're not married by the time you're 30, you never will be. The second tool is subject position, and this is different to how they're understood in conversation analysis or post-structuralism. In CDP, subject positions developed out of positioning theory and are defined as locations within a conversation. Subject positions are the identities made relevant by specific ways of talking, and they are the means through which interpretive repertoires become attached to the social construction of particular selves. As Burr put it, subject positions are the implied positions within a particular discourse that may be occupied or taken up by a person that provide a basis for their identity and experience. And finally, the third tool is ideological dilemmas. Ideological dilemmas flow out of the notion of lived ideologies, which refer to common sense, or what other social theorists can refer to as culture. The crucial feature of lived ideologies is their lack of coherence and integration, and they are characterized instead by contradiction, fragmentation, and inconstancy. What is considered common sense contains many contrary and competing arguments that tell people how to think and act. For example, contradictory proverbs such as many hands make light work, but also that too many cooks spoil the broth. Rather than being dismissed as unreliable and faulty, or having to be resolved into one truth or another, they are seen as flexible and rich resources for social interaction and everyday sense-making. Common sense or lived ideologies can be considered the condensed wisdom of a given society or culture and an assemblage of different arguments and ideas laid down over the course of time. Identities are not equal. Some people struggle to represent themselves in an acceptable way with respect to their culture's local moral rules. And it is through these struggles and negotiation practices that the power of ideologies in contemporary society is made visible by CDP. Next slide, please, Tenzin. In my analysis, the language resources drawn upon the participants were organised into two strongly oppositional interpretive repertoires: the singleness is freedom repertoire and the singleness is deficit repertoire. In the deficit repertoire, singleness is constructed as a failure to marry, a failure of womanhood. In the singleness is freedom repertoire, being single is constructed as being free from the typical constraints associated with marriage and related to the freedom of activity. As a package of ways of talking about singleness, the polarization of resources afforded a very constrained and restricted set of value-opposing subject positions around which singleness as an identity could be negotiated. In terms of identity negotiation strategies, 4 were identified. In terms of the singleness as freedom repertoire, in their talk, speakers anticipated objections and criticism of even mild positive claims related to singleness. In terms of how they negotiated the singleness as deficit repertoire, they employed strategies of distancing and neutralization, and they also worked creatively in their talk to trouble the category imperative related to being single and being identified as Ms. instead of Miss. I identify in my discussion that the content and organisation of singleness discourse has not substantively changed, although younger single women today can perhaps access a more strongly developed discourse of singleness as independence and choice than women born in previous eras. Negative stereotypes clearly persist and remain problematic, and irrespective of age positioning, singleness for women remains an identity of difference and an identity that is difficult to be aligned with. I argue that the work on discourses of women's singleness as an instance of something reaches deep into the heart of social life, into an aspect of social life that most of us don't notice. The kinds of social contracts that we frame our lives around, and the deeply held cultural beliefs and values about human relationships and what makes for a good, productive, and worthwhile life. This is a time when the numbers of single people in many countries continues to rise, and there is growing politicization of singleness discourse, with the coining of the term singleism by Bella Apollo to refer to the discrimination of single people. And to use Joan Eakin's words in an email to me, singlehood is a highly sensitive point of social clarification, and it is across the social spectrum, I suspect, and for people occupying many different intersecting identities. My work has taught me about the need to pay close attention to how we position people in talk and text, whether in daily life or in research practices and in the working of institutions, and for the need to find different ways to fine-tune into issues related to identity. Final slide, please, Tenzin. These are some key texts, and I will end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much to Rona and Ramya for those introductory points about their own research. I just got so excited about the talk and what was happening that I forgot to mention a really key point, which is that Rona and Ramya are both recipients of the Joan Eakin Award for Methodological Excellence in 2019. And this is kind of interesting because it's the first time that we've had 2 dissertation award winners at the same time. And that they've had 2 years now to kind of reflect on their thesis and dissertation work. And this gives them, I think, a really unique perspective from which to talk from today. So I'm just going to now pose, because they're methodological winners, some methodological type questions to both of them to get us kind of started in the dialogue section. So the first question is, Could each of you say something about the issues and tensions related to representation in your respected research?
Okay, I'll respond to that first. So Gayatri Spivak's essay that I mentioned in my talk, so Can the Subaltern Speak, influenced how I thought, through my engagement with participants and the tensions around giving voice to participants. Because I lived in the research setting, I knew many people there. But the division covered a large area and the neighborhoods were segregated, which meant that the people I knew were mostly like me. I needed to spend time establishing relationships with others, particularly women representing disadvantaged groups. I was able to meet some of these women at meetings of the village Samurdhi Society, which brought together recipients of state welfare benefits. Over 90% of these women, or of the attenders, were women. So in my interactions with women, I felt that they saw me first, with these particular social group, they saw me first as a doctor. In fact, many came with health issues, and the village development officer asked me to organize health education seminars and so on. So these initial interactions were very much structured by this doctor-patient kind of relationship. This was the preliminary phase of my research when I was writing up my research proposal. This phase was very useful in terms of building relationships, but it definitely added another 6 months to my process. But I now know that this time spent mattered a lot because my interviews with these women, members of this organization, was very different from my interviews with others who I had not interacted with for a long time. So with the latter, responses were kind of monosyllabic and they were generally reluctant to speak critically of healthcare services. So fortunately, there were others who were not that way, who did not respond in that way. But on the other hand, my interactions with middle-class women were, they were very like vocal, critical. They were even critical of privatization of healthcare, which was exactly what I wanted to hear. So this really made me think about how we represent, research participations when we write up, like whose talk is actually represented in qualitative research. We tend to select the more critical and expressive quotes, and does that mean those who are, more kind of silent or don't say much are left out? So then, how do we engage with them? How do we, given the deadlines for research, all these grant issues and things like that, I think there's no time to really build relationships with research participants, which I think has implications. So although I made a conscious effort to ensure that these participants were not drowned out in my text, I don't think I really addressed the problem, which I think is a structural issue that we really need to think about, especially in health research.
Thank you, Ramya. As you were speaking, it was occurring to me that the power of how people position us and the reciprocal version of how we position other people, how it's a very dynamic thing. So your participants, how they saw you as a doctor and how that shaped the interactions and the language that we'd used and what they would say to you. So if I was to think about that question in terms of my own research, I think I would say the way that single women in the health literature were represented, I found often really shocking and quite offensive. And the representations tended to reify those negative stereotypes you're familiar with. One example that is burned in the back of my brain was in a gerontology textbook by Eakin. He quoted that the traditional stereotypes of the, quote, elderly spinster were identified to be someone who is lonesome, egocentric, neurotic, irresponsible, or immoral deviant. Immoral deviant. So how the terms that we use to refer to older single women, how these terms position them as being lonely, lacking, vulnerable, unfamilied, non-familied, asocial, unmarried, never married. So there was a reproduction of the mundane and kind of formulaic accounts. In the few qualitative research studies I looked at, often what the women said was taken at face value. Whereas to me, I think it raises really important questions about how do we account for ourselves and what influences those accounts. It was really troubling to read those accounts as a novice qualitative health researcher. There's a tension here between the power and the authoritarian claims in realist literature, surveys and questionnaires. It was hard to resist evaluating those studies in their own terms and to resist sliding back into that positivist ontology and epistemology. And as someone who'd been swimming in that discourse for a very long time, and I didn't know at that point that there really were other ontologies and epistemologies. So it wasn't until I came across the pioneering work of Jill Reynolds, who produced the book Single Woman, a discursive investigation. I had no concept of CDP at the time, but I recognized in her text elements of my own experience as a single woman that I didn't have language for, that I couldn't have articulated. So that was, in part, I headed towards a theory methodology that would help me also speak to my own experience, but also as a way to open up ways of thinking about singleness that in ways that I had not seen previously in the literature. Maybe leave it there for now, Paul, for that.
Yes, excellent. Some really exciting and interesting ideas that I think may be picked up in the open discussion afterwards. But let's move on a little bit to, so how did your selected theory methodology shape your understanding and experience of the research process itself?
I can speak to that first, Ramya, if that's okay. So I took to heart Joan's "everything is data" phrase. Oh my goodness, that's also burned in the back of my brain. And because my thesis topic was a topic that many people had things to say about, and I took every opportunity I could to tell people about my research and to pay really close attention to how they responded. And I noticed when I presented preliminary work at conferences, there were a number of women who prefer to come up to me quietly. They didn't ask questions in the large forums. They came up quietly afterwards to talk to me about their stories because they didn't feel safe to out themselves as single women in a public forum and to be subject to other people's curiosity about them. The other thing about the issues and tensions was I think Jennifer Poole gave me this phrase, bumping into discourse. No matter how many conversations I had with people, I was always bumping into discourse, sometimes falling over it. And I was really curious how the number, often widowed women or women who were divorced, they just wanted to ask me whether my participants had had sex. That was what they were concerned about. And I'm always thinking, what is this about? Like, what is going on here that they feel that this is a legitimate question to ask? And there's another second point to that is in the ethics. Ethics are a fantastic way to think about discourse, bumping into discourse there. So when I did a preliminary ethics consultation, one of the concerns was identified as how will the potential distress or sadness of the participants in talking about their lives as lifelong single women be addressed? So this is likely not a concern that would have been raised if I'd interviewed older married women, and the study has been about marriage. With widows, you might expect sadness and distress that could accompany the loss of a spouse. But why would lifelong single women be expected to be sad and distressed? So part of the water that we swim in, and it's part of what my thesis sought to problematize, is actually being lived out in the very process of doing the research. Ramya, would you like?
Sorry. I think that using critical qualitative methodologies really opened, I guess, new epistemological avenues, maybe. I began to see the research enterprise and the academy, I think, in a different light. So I think that was where my research methodology really sort of, that was like bang sort of thing, you know. Above all, it made visible the elite and exclusive character of the academy. Research, I don't think research is actually geared towards bridging social inequality, unfortunately. In fact, I think research and higher education as it is now reinforces social inequality at many levels. So in Toronto, the eliteness of academia I observed is both classed and raced. This means that certain research questions are privileged over others. Research tends to focus on underprivileged groups and is undertaken mostly by middle-class researchers, which in turn obviously influence what questions are asked and the findings. And the second issue is that, you know, my methodology demands like a sort of praxis-oriented research or knowledge production. And most disciplines have moved away from being praxis-oriented to being confined to ivory towers. This means that knowledge is created for its own sake rather than for social change. So as Joyce Sprague points out, this is not always the case. And I often reflect on this issue. Lastly, although my research critiqued healthcare privatization, that gave me again a lens. I mean, it sort of influenced the way I thought about education and the privatization and the commercialization of education. So my experience as a graduate student really made me think about, you know, what has happened to the research enterprise, whether it's in terms of publication, whether it's in terms of accessing journals, and you only need to consider the disciplines that get funded, which do not, which type of research gets funded within our disciplines, what gets funded and what does not. So once knowledge production processes are laid bare, I think we start questioning everything, and it's rather exhausting also.
Thank you. Yeah. I have one more question and then we'll open it up because I'm sure that you've generated a lot of sparks in our CQ audience here. So I'm just wondering if each of you could speak to how your research speaks back to your respective disciplines.
This is something that I continue to wrestle with. I think my theory methodology has sensitized me to the vested interest of professional discourses and identities. And because I am someone positioned in occupational therapy and occupational science, that's an ongoing source of tension for me. And so what my work did and what I wanted it to do was to contribute to a small and developing body of literature called critical occupational therapy. One of our leading independent scholars, Karen Woolley-Hamill, you know, she called for the profession. We need to develop an acute sensitivity to the embedded values and assumptions in society in our professions, and to cultivate a self-awareness of our personal values and perspectives and biases. So my work speaks into a small but growing space. But because the research was on women's singleness, of course I could not ignore the fact that OT in Canada at least is a pretty privileged white middle class profession, and not exclusively, but largely. And so for me, because of the norms within these populations and the leaders in our profession over the last number of decades, I think it's created a blind spot because of the privilege associated with marriage and having children, the normative life course. So I mean, although I hesitate to use the metaphor blind spot, I do think it's really helpful to have research that points out that which we can't see because we're swimming in that discourse so deeply. And I advocated for the development of anti-oppressive practice in occupational therapy. That's slow to get off the ground, but I perhaps things will gather momentum and there will be more conversations about that, because I think we really do need it in the discipline.
I just have one point, I guess. I mean, the main thing I think my research sort of sheds light on the interconnectedness of the micro, meso, and macro levels, I guess. So in public health, we tend to either focus on what's happening on the ground, field, in the field, or, whatever you want to call it, or the policy level, but we do not really, we're not trained to kind of connect the dots, sort of to understand how macro structures or processes shape what happens on the ground. So I think as healthcare professionals, policymakers, researchers, all these folks, it's really crucial that we understand the bigger picture. And I think my thesis kind of provides that in terms of healthcare access.
Thank you both. I have so many more questions, but I think I should open it up a little bit and see if there's anybody in our CQ audience who would like to ask a question. So you can either raise your hand in the reactions menu, or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can type it into the chat and we will follow that. Just
Holly?
yes.
Can we put our videos on now as an audience?
Oh, yes, that would be grand. Thanks.
Great.
Great to see all of you.
Yeah.
I love this. There's like a whole bunch of people here that I also haven't seen in a while. So this is really fun.
Hello, Margaret.
Holly.
Hi.
Okay.
I just wanted to say
Jane.
thank you so much to Rona and Ramya for these wonderful presentations. It keeps me connected to continually thinking critically, and particularly for Rona's presentation to remind me that being single is great and I love it. And this is why. And just every time I hear Rona, I remember.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Kay James has their hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
So firstly, congratulations to both speakers on your amazing work. It's really cool to hear, especially as like a junior researcher, I guess, starting out. My question is specifically for Dr. Macdonald. In your explanation of discourse, you were talking about how it is created, situated, understood within culture. And so my question for you is, in what ways were the participants in your study of the same culture, and in what ways were they not? I guess however you would like to define culture.
Yeah, same and different. Yeah, well, it's a very freighted term, isn't it, culture? And I was also, excuse me, aware when Ramya was talking how Eurocentric my theory methodology is. It was developed by Margaret Wetherell and Jonathan Potter, and white European researchers, social psychologists. And I think there's a part of my own cultural background that can connect to the ideas, in part because of the cultural context it developed in. In terms of the participants that who wanted to talk to me, I had to, in the end, I advertised publicly and got virtually no response, which is not unusual perhaps. But I was reflecting as I recruited that it's often not safe for people to talk about singleness in their lives. It hasn't been safe. So why would they feel safe speaking to somebody they don't know? And so snowball sampling seemed to be the way to go. People who knew people who knew people, and my participants recommended other people, their friends, to take part in it. And I think the discourse and the patterns I identified were shaped by the fact that my participants came from European backgrounds. They were white. Two of them were brought up in Canada, and there were strong similarities across European research and British research on singleness discourse and what I was hearing here in Canada. So I recognized that if other people had wanted to speak to me, and my name, of course, signals my colonial heritage, I would have probably encountered a different sets of discourses, perhaps more varied. I'm not sure whether they would just be inflected slightly differently or the emphasis would be different. But it's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking it.
Thanks for your response.
There's a question in the chat here for Ramya, so we'll just ask that. How did you get around the difficulty of addressing the significant presence of those who do not articulate their views in the way you thought they, quote, should? Were relatively silent, or whose responses or non-responses complicated the picture of representation of class and gender? I necessarily refer to the marginal that you referred to earlier. So this is from Sumati. So if you want to, if that's not clear, then we'll ask for some clarification. Ramya?
No, it's clear. And actually, Sumati is one of the people who I thanked in my talk. So she asked really difficult questions, which has, I think, made me think a lot earlier. So in this instance, I was not really saying that I thought women should respond in a particular way. I'm sorry if that sort of I conveyed that. What I meant was that there was a tendency for people who are more sort of maybe comfortable with me to be more expressive and kind of speak in longer sentences, and then I had a nice quote or whatever. But how I got around it was I think I tried to say that as well. I don't think I got around that. I tried to by in my initial engagement, I was writing my proposals for I was in Kandy working on establishing relationships, like trying to figure out who I was, these neighborhoods, who I was going to include, who I was not. In that process, I got to know a lot of people from these neighborhoods, and those women, they were comfortable enough to speak to me. But what I was saying is that in most research projects, people don't do that. There's no time to sort of spend months and months doing that. And just the way in public health, I'm sure in disciplines like anthropology and sociology and humanities, it's not like that. Sumati is a professor in English, by the way, in Sri Lanka. So we don't do that. So in public health, it's not like that. So that's why I was questioning what actually gets to in these publications, who is represented there. That was my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramya.
I'm just bouncing off a couple of ideas from there. So Ramya, as you was talking, you raised questions. I've got a note in saying, what is dialogue? What constitutes dialogue? It's one of those unanswered questions for me. And the other thing about the richness of what people are saying, it seems to me, I learned, and perhaps I mislearned this in my qualitative health research courses, that the gold that you were looking for is always thick, rich description. That seemed to be what people, and preferably narratives that make you weep. That is it. Sally Thorne called that lachrymosal validity. So what I found in my work is I liked critical discursive psychology because you could do a lot with very little, and actually. Discourse data is rich data, even though it may not necessarily come across as being thick, rich data in the traditional sense of that word. That was just ping-ponging off Ramya, what Ramya was saying.
Okay, thank you both. There's another question in the chat from somebody who's currently undertaking a critical discourse analysis. It sounds like maybe for the first time. And they're looking into the literature, and I think this is a question for you, Rona, that sometimes when they're reading it, there's articles that give specific frameworks for coding, and others, they just state that they're doing it and then they present their findings. And the question is, from your experience and knowledge in this area, do you think there are advantages or disadvantages that this person should consider in this?
Ooh, well, you're asking a question about critical discourse analysis, and I have never done critical discourse analysis, but I have certainly wrestled with the issues of analysis. The tools that I had really helped guide my analytic process. And I find that what was helpful for me, and maybe this isn't answering your question, but I glommed onto articles that actually applied the kind of discourse analysis I was using. So the actual hands-on, let's have a look at how they did the analysis. And I read them over and over and over and over again. And there was a wonderful paper by Antanki Billigan, among others, who actually wrote a fantastic paper. It's like shortcomings of discourse analysis, which essentially was things you need to avoid doing. So I find it really helpful to be guided by exemplary examples of the analysis, which really showed me what was possible, and then what pitfalls to avoid, which, traps to avoid falling down, and then to just keep playing and working and working and working. Coding is one of these words that I always think is more machine-like, and I certainly don't consider the process I undertook with my analysis as being in any way machine-like. It was chaotic and messy. You construct it as you go along. So it's getting that balance between avoiding doing the things that you really don't want to do, being inspired by those papers that really open up, and it doesn't matter what topic it's on, but can help you, and then trying to steer a path down the middle. I hope that's spoken.
Yes, complex, messy, all these things, those are CQ, those are critical qualitative words for sure. And on that note, I was hoping this would happen. Otherwise, I might have had to voluntold her. But Joan Eakin has her hand up to ask a question. And as those of you who know, this award that both Ramya and Rona were recipients of is the Joan Eakin Dissertation Award. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Joan. Thanks.
There, can I be heard? Okay, I'm quite far in the country and it's snowing so hard, it's unbelievable. And so my connection has been a little iffy, but I hope it lasts. Thank you so much, you two, for your presentations. I love these. I love attending these award presentations and keeping up with where people are. You did a lovely job, and it was very stimulating and very thought-provoking and insightful. Thank you. I wondered if you might comment on something that always worries me. Is not the word really. It just it continues to interest me, and I haven't found a landing yet. Even since I'm retired, I've had a whole career thinking about it, and I still haven't landed in how we deal with methodologically. With contradictions and inconsistencies that we find. I used to teach that there was nothing better than a good contradiction or inconsistency in data, because it prompted you to kind of look at it and say, well, what is this inconsistent with? What am I imposing on this that makes it inconsistent? And what does it do for me? What does it what does it do for my analytic approach to be able to untangle these contradictions and inconsistencies? So it was sort of a methodological thing. But I've since begun to think that it's not just that, because underlying that methodology is the quest to try to iron it all out, like the proper analysis would somehow come to some terms with inconsistencies, like account for it, why it appears to be inconsistent, but really when you get beneath it, it's not so inconsistent. You just have to understand it better to be able to deal with the inconsistency. But I'm beginning to think also in light of sort of new theoretical perspectives that who says things are always consistent? Like, how do we deal with this theoretically when we have things that aren't consistent? Do we end up, how do we present it, for starters? I mean, it's one thing to present it to an audience of critical qualitative researchers who know that you always stand in a particular theoretical perspective, in a particular place, and you always use words, as you pointed out, Rona, that frame and characterize things in very particular ways. You don't have to explain that to qualitative researchers, but you do have to do something with that when you're talking to audiences that are more positivist. And how do you explain that? Do you end up, saying that it is simply inconsistent and that's the way it is? Or do you find a theoretical framework that accommodates and deals with inconsistencies? And I was wondering if you could comment, both of you, on, in your work, what did you do with things that were contradictions? And somebody just asked about that a little bit. I thought it was going to go there, but could you say a bit more of what you did with them? And did you try to iron them out and to sort them out and to find a place that didn't have inconsistencies? Or did you just accept them and deal with it theoretically?
Ramya, I can speak to that first if you're comfortable with that. So thank you, Joan. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for your question. I was telling Pauli the other day, I used to come to CQUI talks and I always wrote down your questions because they were the killer questions that I knew I would want to spend more time going over. So how do we deal with contradictions and inconsistencies? One of the things I liked about critical discursive psychology is that actually that's where the action is. So I was looking for those contradictions and inconsistencies. For example, in a transcript, a woman would say, I love being a single woman. I love living alone. I could do all these things by myself. 4 paragraphs later, I never think of myself as being single. It's just completely irrelevant to my life. So the way I interpreted those complete contradictions was they were being used to do something in talk. They were being used to, these women were using these words to negotiate their identity in order to claim it and distance from it, and claim it and distance from it. So I didn't have to resolve it. It became where the action was. It became the practice I was interested in and became part of my analysis. Now, your second point of that question is, how do we present it to other audiences? Now, there is, I mean, really, how do you do that? I have absolutely no idea how. Explaining critical discursive psychology to myself and now to you has been a big enough challenge. Explaining it to people who are deeply entrenched and perhaps don't know it in the positivist tradition is a whole other set of gambits. But I think having theory that at least you can foreground and say, hey, this allows you to look at things in a different way. And why is consistency so important? Like, what is behind the fact that people are saying the same thing, and what could that mean? So I always feel as though I'm just trying to turn that turf over and over and over again. And that slide into positive ways of thinking and thematic content analysis and qualitative research studies. It's just, I feel as though I'm laboring against that a lot. So Ramya.
Yeah, I was sort of waiting for the difficult question as well from Joan. So in my case, like the way I guess the way I approach experience, or the stories that women shared, it didn't really matter too much whether there was consistency or not. Like, I think the beauty of qualitative research is that even a single experience is sort of, it sheds light on something that we can take out of it. And since we're not really, at least since I was not looking to uncover a truth about, say, what I was studying, consistency did not, I mean, it didn't really matter for me to say whether everyone had that experience or not. Having said that, though, then we need to sort of, I actually went ahead and did a very simple thematic analysis on Rona. But that was also because I knew I was coming back to teaching medicine, and I wanted to keep my dissertation or my papers something that's accessible to this audience as well. So that's interesting that you asked this question about how to present it to another audience, because again, I always struggle with this. When you read qualitative publications, very often it'd be like most participants said something, or whatever, but I tried to not do that. I mean, I actually didn't do that intentionally, because that wasn't something that I wanted to show, like that wasn't what I was looking for in my research, I guess. I don't know, I don't think I answered your question very well, Joan. Sorry, but I did my best.
Ramya, I'm just thinking about the thematic content analysis. I've read wonderful analyses that is thematic content analysis. I'm not against them per se.
No,
I think they can be really, really helpful. And it's when there's a lack of theory to inform them, and how it sits, how it doesn't get, often it doesn't get below that level of mundane, and that's what I think is really important to get belong. And I know you did that in your research. I'll stop there.
Thank you both again. Thanks, Joan. Awesome. So there's another question from the chat here from Jasmine, and she's picking up on this spoken word and dialogue that both of you speak about in your work, which I think is really beautiful. And she's asking, in what ways is prioritizing spoken word, maintaining and reproducing cultural discourses, perhaps colonizing over other forms of knowing? Did other forms of data come up in your research that represented experience? Perhaps the ways women's bodies embody emotions, intentions, and intensities through our conversations and rich data.
Ramya, would you like?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I didn't really engage with, I mean, it's very important, but I didn't do that. I didn't look at the ways in which women's bodies embody emotions, intentions, and intensities. Thank you for that question, but I didn't do it. So I'm just wondering whether you, Rona, could you address that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking it. With the focus on talk translated into text, it's yeah, there's a lot that's missed, and it's certainly one of the criticisms of discourse, a focus on discourse and discourse analysis, that body is left out. And your question resonates for me, particularly at the moment, because I'm doing an arts-informed research. I'm facilitating hand mapping with people living with traumatic brain injury online. And one of the things I'm wrestling with is what shifts when people draw and they become embodied in a different way. They are creating this hand map or body map through art, which is not word. I mean, I ask people to speak about their experiences, but it misses out a lot. And so I think your question is a really important one. And I also struggled with the focus on discourse because I recognize that it would analyze, talk about emotions. It would see it as being an emotions discourse. And in partly because of the narratives I'm hearing at the moment are really so powerfully traumatic, that I'm thinking much more about suffering and how do we understand suffering, how is suffering embodied, how to work with that. And so, like any approach, I guess it's good for certain things and not good for others. But I think it's a wonderful question you're asking, and I will continue to think about how to work with those ideas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more quick question. And so this is something for both of you. I mean, it's interesting because it's 2 years out now since you've completed the work that you were presenting about today. And reflecting on the work that you do now, I guess just briefly, how would you say the theory and methodologies that you worked with continue to influence your thinking today?
Shall I go with that one first? Okay. So I think for one, I cannot practice medicine, which is actually quite sad for me because it's just transformed the way I think about medicine, about, the assumptions of biomedicine and, I think in order to be able to actually have a doctor-patient interaction that's sort of structured in the way it should be, you need to sort of keep it simple. And having all these questions in my mind, it's not very helpful. So that's one thing. And then the second point I want to talk about is the space to do qualitative research in a faculty of medicine, which is where I work at the moment. So it's really, there's no legitimacy, no recognition or anything. But having said that, my research methodology, I feel, doesn't really privilege, I mean, of course, I'm sort of very into qualitative research, but in fact, it does not really dictate whether I need to work with numbers or words. I think I can undertake critical quantitative research that, like you could use numbers in a non-positivist sense. And I think I'm doing that right now. So for example, I recently did a study on I was looking at out-of-pocket I'm interested in healthcare financing. So out-of-pocket expenditures on prenatal care. But right throughout the process, I was really thinking about how, even like when you have close-ended questions in a survey and it's interview administered, they're never really close-ended. So what does it really mean to do, like, I constantly question whether it's even possible to do sort of this unbiased, positivist, quantitative research. But it's been an exciting experience for me because I reflect on the positivist underpinnings of research, and they don't really make too much sense. Yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you.
Rona?
Thank you, Ramya.
1 minute.
Well, I think when you do discourse analysis, it does your head in, basically. I think Rosalind Gill said, everyone doing discourse analysis should come, it should come with a health warning because it radically transforms the way you look at the world. So now in my postdoc position, with me there are questions and questions and questions. I'm interested in how people use categories in relation to their identities. I'm interested in how we position one another in our micro practices, in our small encounters, whether they are clinical or on the street with our masks on or in an emerge setting. And I think what I really loved, it was strange, it sounds a bit nerdish. What I loved about studying the discourse was that I learned a new language. I learned what footings were and hedges and extreme case formulations and concessions and all these argument types I'd never heard before. And every time I listen or read a text, I'm going, oh, there's a hedge, or oh, there's an extreme case formulation. So there's really no going back. But of course, it does create a lot of challenges in a current climate where employment is extremely precarious. I'm interested to see how critical ideas, critical qualitative research can be moved out of the academy, and how it would fare in making social change in community settings.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thanks to everybody who came today. Thank you for the CQ Dissertation Award Committee, who spent a lot of time reviewing both theses, to Joan and the CQ people, many of whom the faculty that you've both spoken about today, and for all of you who came. It's been an absolute pleasure, and a lot of work put to taking two quite different theses and spending the time to look at that common ground. And so I think that you did an excellent job, and you can see lots of accolades in the chat here. People have been very inspired. So thank you both, and thanks to everybody too for coming.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.